And Jesus said, "In this world you will have trouble and sorrow." I said last week that we are born and we die. And just as surely, I would say to you this morning, we will experience grief. Eventually, every single one of us experiences grief in our lives. And you, of course, know there are all sorts of grief. There's the grief of divorce or the fracturing of a family. There's the grief of having to leave a home place that you love and move somewhere else. There's the grief that comes when someone comes to you in the workplace and says, "We no longer need you, we're downsizing." There's the grief of watching the aging process take its toll upon you mentally and physically. There's the grief of separation, of having a spouse cross the sea perhaps in the armed services. But this morning, our focus is on the grief we experience when someone dies. We're going to focus this morning on that particular type of grief, the grief we feel when someone we love dies. And so let me share with you 5 insights. First of all, grief and loss is necessary and healthy. Grief and loss is absolutely necessary and healthy. There are, as you might imagine, many excellent resources for helping us Christians through the journey of grief, and if you'd like some of those titles, I'll be glad to share them with you. But among the many excellent resources available to you and me is a book titled Good Grief, written by Dr. Granger Westberg. And it's interesting, isn't it, that it's titled Good Grief? Because that seems like an oxymoron, doesn't it? Good and grief. But Dr. Westberg's point is that grief is indeed good. It is good because it is necessary, and it is good because ultimately it is the journey to healing and wholeness. And he even goes so far as to say in that book that it is ridiculous, those are his exact words, it is ridiculous for people to believe that Christians don't need to grieve. And one of the things I want to help you with this morning is understand that you do not need to diminish your grief, nor do you need to diminish the grief of someone else. Sometimes we well-meaning folks, as persons go through grief, seek to help them by saying things like, "Well, just have faith and it will be all right." Or, "Give it all to God and He will take the hurt away." Or, "The sooner you can get back to things as normal, the better you'll be spiritually and emotionally." Or, "Well, just give thanks for the time you had together and now with God's help, move on." Listen to me very carefully. You and I have no business seeking to diminish someone's grief any more than someone needs to diminish our grief. We are not spiritual robots. We are rather human beings with feelings and emotions, and at certain times in life, those feelings and those emotions must come forth. Remember what Jesus said in the 5th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew when He said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." I mean, right there, Jesus is telling us that in mourning, in grieving, we find comfort, we find healing. So the first thing I want to say to you this morning as we talk about grief is that it is absolutely essential and healthy. The second thing I would say to you this morning is healthy grief embodies certain principles. Healthy grief embodies certain principles. And I'm going to share with you what I see personally to be 7 principles that are inherent in healthy grief. Now, I know it's rather tedious for me to have a point of a sermon and then under that point have 7 things. But bear with me. These are important. 7 principles inherent in healthy grief. First of all, anger is a normal emotion in some experiences of grief. It can be anger at life, anger at the circumstances. It can be anger at God. It can even be anger at the deceased person who's left you here alone. But never tell someone that they don't have a right or they shouldn't be angry in the midst of their grief. Anger is a normal human emotion in much grief. Secondly, one shouldn't shut down one's emotions. One should cry when one feels like crying. I mean, Westberg reminds us that John said that Jesus wept. And Westberg goes on to say this, God has given us tear glands, and we're supposed to use them when we have good reason to use them. I love that. God has given us tear glands, and He expects us to use those tear glands. They're there for a purpose. They're there to cry. And folks, when you're going through grief, don't let anybody tell you that it's time to quit crying. Crying is a normal expression of the feeling of loss. Thirdly, regret and guilt are common emotional responses. As you know, I've been a pastor for over 40 years, and as I've dealt with persons on the grieving process, I've often heard them exude all sorts of regrets and exemplify guilt. You know, maybe they regret what they should have done and didn't do, or what they should have said and didn't say. They feel guilty that they remember an occasion when they should have said something to that person and didn't say it, or they said something to that person they wish they hadn't said. That's just normal to have regrets and feel guilt at the loss of a loved one. Fourthly, even good Christians can battle depression after a great loss. And you know I believe that. I preached on depression many weeks ago. It's normal to experience some emotions of depressions. I don't care how deep your faith. Depression is a normal response to great loss. Fifth thing, there is no arbitrary timeline for how long one can or should grieve. This may be the greatest mistake that many of us make, whether it's in our own grief or in what we say to others. There is no such thing, listen to me very carefully, there is no such thing as a defined timeline for when one should be through with his or her grief. You may read something that says in a year's time, you ought to be down the road and past your grief. Hogwash. And I don't often use that word. That's hogwash. There is no such thing as a defined time for a human being who is experiencing loss in his or her life. You see, we're all psychologically and physiologically different, aren't we? So we're going to handle grief differently. And every grief is different. And so nobody's grief journey or timeline can be the same. Sixth thing is, one must not shut others out. You know what the first thing a person does after the funeral's over? The first thing a normal human being does is go to his or her home, close the door, and hope nobody calls. The first thing a person who is grieving the loss of a loved one tends to do after the service, after the family's gone, after the friends are gone, is go into that house, close the door for some private solace. And that's all fine and good. You need that private time. But one of the worst things we can do is shut other people out. We need, when the time is right, to invite others in. We need to open up to somebody that we trust and be honest with them about all these feelings that were happening. We need to talk to somebody, be open to somebody. And then the seventh thing I would say is some grief is harder than others. Again, not all grief is the same. You know what I think the most difficult grief is? The loss of a child. I don't believe anything compares to the loss of a child. Whether it's the loss of that child in the womb, or the loss of that child born prematurely or by stillborn, or the loss of that child well before he or she should have left this earth, or the loss of that child before that child becomes an adult, or perhaps even the loss of that child as an adult, when your parents are thinking parents should not outlive their children, right? There is nothing harder than losing a child. So understand that when you're related to somebody who has lost a child, understand there is nothing harder in all of life than to lose a child. Secondly, is to be a young spouse who loses your spouse. I, on Memorial Day, turned on my computer, or I guess the day after Memorial Day, turned on my computer on the MSNBC screen, which is on my computer. And there were pictures from Memorial Day, so I went and looked through all those pictures just as a part of my touching base with Memorial Day. And there was a picture there that I cannot forget. It's a young woman in her 20s, I'm assuming in her 20s, and she's kneeled on the ground in front of the tomb of her husband, who had been killed in Afghanistan. And as she's kneeling there in front of that tomb, she is grasping, with her head bowed into his chest, her 17-month-old son. And the 17-month-old son has his arms around the mother's head, and they are clasped ever so tightly. And her head is bowed, and if you could see her face, you would know that tears were flowing as she knelt at that grave with her 17-month-old son at her husband who had died in Afghanistan. I went back yesterday as I was finishing up this sermon and went back and pulled up those pictures, and I made a copy of that picture, and I prayed for her. Because I know that's a tough journey ahead for that young mother and that now young widow. And then it's a tough thing when it's a tragedy, a sudden tragedy, and you have no preparation whatsoever for it. It just happens. And it happens suddenly and sadly. Some grief is a lot harder than others. The third thing I would say to you this morning, the journey of grief is not necessarily predictable or progressive. You know what we tend to think? We tend to think that grief is like step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and then we're at the end of grief. So if I can get through step 1 in my grief journey and just get to step 2 with God's help, and I can get to step 3 with the support of others, and then I can get to step 4, finally I'll get to step 5, and I'll get to step 6, and eventually I'll be there in my healing moment, and that is absolutely not true, and you know it. Grief is not 1 step, 2 step, 3 step. Grief is like 1 step forward and 2 steps back. It's 2 steps forward and 1 step back, 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. The journey of grief is not predictable, and it is typically not incrementally progressive. And so when we expect someone after some months of grieving to have gotten to X place, we're being unfair to that person. Make sense? Because we're expecting them to just go 1, 2, 3, 4. But as I've already acknowledged, the timeline for them may be different, the emotions may be different, the experience may be different, and they may take 3 steps forward and everything be going great, and all of a sudden something triggers all the emotions, and they step back 2 steps. There is no such thing as absolutely progressive grief. It is typically quite jagged. One of the things I say to families at the graveside is that God gives us certain gifts to help us through the journey of grief. And one of those gifts is the gift of memory. But you know, memory is a tricky thing, isn't it? Memory can be wonderful, and memory can be painful. And what I tell the families at the gravesite is that get ready for the unexpected with your memories. Get ready for that day 6 months down the road when you think you're moving along rather well, and you think you've got your emotions in check, and all of a sudden you walk by a picture. There's a picture of that loved one. And just before you can know it, the emotions start welling up, the tears may come, all because you walk by the picture, the memory. It triggers that. When my father died of pancreatic cancer, as I shared last week, and he died when he was in his 60s, early 60s. I was in my 30s. 2 years later, I still remember this, 2 years later, I'm doing great. We've gotten past that. And I happened to walk by a picture of my dad in his highway patrolman uniform that we have. And I just casually walked by that picture, and it hit me how much I missed him. Just like that, out of the blue. Emotions can be triggered long down the journey because there is not absolutely progressive grief. Next thing I would say to you, fourthly, is there are some do's and don'ts about grieving and helping those who are grieving. Some do's and don'ts for those of us who want to help people who are grieving. Let me share with you the do's first. Do encourage the grieving person to talk. Do listen. Do offer to do simple things like bringing a meal or mowing the lawn or helping with the children or helping clean the house. Do send periodic notes of encouragement, and do pray for the person. But let me tell you what not to do. You know all those things. Let me tell you what not to do. The don'ts of dealing with the grieving persons. Don't play theologian. Don't try to give the answer to the question, why? Even we trained clergy are not prepared to answer every person's question, why? And one of the worst ways we play theologian is to say it's God's will. Please do me a favor. But more importantly, do somebody else a favor. Don't play theologian. They don't need theologians, they need friends. They don't need theologians, they need comforters. And when we try to answer the theological questions and think we've got the answer to why, or we think this is God's will, we have done them a disservice. Now, if that individual determines for himself or herself it is God's will, that's one thing. But for you or me to say, well, it's God's will. Don't play theologian. Secondly, avoid platitudes. You know, platitudes like, well, at least he's with God. You know what the person's thinking? I don't want him to be with God. I want him to be with me. That doesn't help me. Or you'll have children someday. You'll have other children someday. Pat and I lost, I don't know how many of you know this, Pat and I lost our first child, born prematurely at 6.5 months. The child was born, Pat had been on bed rest for some time. The child was born, lived a very short while and died at 6.5 months. You know what hurt us the most? Well, you'll have other children someday. It wasn't other children we wanted, it was Richard that we wanted. And it took us a while to get over that. I was a young preacher. We were a young couple, and yeah, someday, hopefully we would have children. But that's not what we needed to hear at that time. Don't say you'll have other children someday. Another platitude is just remember the good life you've had together. Well, you know what the person's thinking? I want that good life now. I need it now. I'm lonely. Or God needed her in heaven. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. We're better than that, aren't we? We understand God better than that, don't we? That God takes somebody because He needs them in heaven. You think God can't do the work of the kingdom of God without taking you or me from this earth? It's a platitude that does more harm than help. Don't play counselor. That's another don't. Don't play counselor. Another one is don't push the person to recover too fast. Talked about that. And finally, don't give up on the person. Don't give up. You're thinking often, he or she ought to be past this. They shouldn't get so emotional. It shouldn't be so painful. We don't know that unless we've been there. Don't give up on being there for the person who needs you. And fifthly, I would say to you this morning, the goal is to move from grief to gratitude. The goal of the journey is to move from grief to gratitude. I came across a very moving story just a few days ago, about a week ago, I guess, about a little girl named Rachel. The title of the article that I read was Rachel's Legacy. True story. Rachel was a 9-year-old, and a speaker came to their church to talk about wells for Africa and the need for building more wells in Africa so they could have clean water. And it's called, the organization is called Charity Water. Well, she heard the speaker from Charity Water. She got all hyped up, and so this 9-year-old Rachel decides she's going to raise $300 for Charity Water by her 9th birthday. And so she sends the message out to all the family and all the friends and says, what I want for my birthday is for you to make a contribution to Charity Water and let's build wells in Africa. And comes her 9th birthday, and she's short of the $300, but yet she had gotten close. Tragically, on July the 20th, 2011, 3 weeks after her 9th birthday, Rachel was killed in a car accident. And thus this article. Word of Rachel's birthday wish spread quickly after her death, and her story was picked up by national news outlets including NBC News, the New York Times, and CNN. Donations to charity, water in her name, from strangers all across the world began to come in. In just a few weeks, pledges for the Rachel's Wish campaign topped $1.2 million. The money is going to projects that will bring clean drinking water to 60,000 people in Ethiopia, according to Charity Water. But that's not the end of the story. Just this past Thursday, her mother and her father, her pastor, and members of the congregation where she had first become inspired about Charity Water flew to Ethiopia. You know what they were going to do? They were going there to see the wells that had been built in memory of Rachel. So the mother and father thought, how do we honor and remember her 1 year after her death? And what they did was get on a plane and fly to Ethiopia to view the wells that were built in Rachel's name. And you know what they said? They said there's only one way to really honor her life, and that's to give thanks for it and to do something in remembrance of it. You know you're moving to healing or some level of healing when you feel gratitude for and a desire to remember faithfully the person. Our goal is to let the grief journey lead us to absolute thanksgiving for the life of the person. Now, I'm going to begin next week's sermon with the end of this sermon. How's that sound? Because I'm going to conclude with this statement. Ultimately, healing comes for us all with God's help. That's the summation. It's where I'm going to start next week. So what do we say about grief? First of all, that grief is necessary and healthy. Secondly, there are certain principles that are inherent in grief, and I named 7. The journey of grief is not predictable or progressive. There are do's and there are don'ts, and we need to learn them. And the goal ultimately is to move from grief to gratitude. Thanks be to God. Amen. I call your attention now to the back of your hymnal. To our affirmation of faith, number 887, and let us stand as we affirm our faith together. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? Our hymn of dedication this morning is hymn number 529, How Firm a Foundation. If there are persons in this fellowship this morning who've not made a commitment to Jesus Christ as Lord of your life and who are feeling called by the Spirit to make that decision this morning, we extend that invitation to you and we encourage you in that decision. If you've not made a commitment to Christ as Lord of your life, and this is the day, you can do so privately right where you are between you and God. You can come here to this altar and share it with us publicly. If there are persons interested in becoming members of Germantown,